Well, in 3.5 years of doing forums, I've never written anything down to say. But today, because I didn't want to screw this up and I didn't want to leave anything out, I wrote an introduction for our guest today. It'll be short. In 1981, I hitchhiked to Geneva, New York to see a triple bill. Squeeze, the English Beat, and a new American band I just heard about called REM. I went to NYU from 1981 to 1985. I worked at the radio station. There was this guy named Hugh, big redheaded kid, who was used in an MTV promo that they aired, like these little man on the street promos. And in this promo, Hugh said, "I think when I'm 50, I'll still be listening to REM." And I remember thinking, yeah, I can see that. Well, this year I turned 50. And I'm still enjoying 15 major REM album releases from over the years. We jumped to 1987, and I actually get to work for IRS Records during REM's peak period there. I'm sitting in my hometown of New York City, hanging out in Radio City Music Hall, seeing these incredible, enormous shows around their Document World Tour. Shortly after, I started working for Warner Brothers Records, when REM was at Warner Brothers. And a few years later, I was tour managing an artist I was interested in managing called Throwing Muses, as they toured as an opening act for REM that year in 1989. Things I remember about that experience, despite having my mind blown every day, they were all so nice. They were all so cool. They all behaved as we thought we would behave if we were in their positions. REM paid the Muses their club headliner rate, which was a lot of money to pay an opening band back then. The Muses were given a full sound check every day, full use of the PA, full volume every day. REM carried and set up our gear every day. I got to watch sound check every single day of the tour. I watched the show every single night. I found my artist management partner through REM. I was unsure as to whether or not I could even manage a band when the Muses asked me to manage them on that tour. And on that tour, I was connected with the people and the ideas that I needed at that precise moment in my life. I can honestly say I'm only a manager because of our guest this evening. I openly worshiped REM's organization and business ethos, as well as their values-driven practices. I modeled myself after them and their business. I have Bertis to thank for his example of artist management with grace and decency. And in a way, I have Bertis to thank for my family and for the life I lead now. So please welcome Bertis Downs. Wow,
thank you.
Thank you, so good to see you.
Well, that was a little over the top.
I think I'm gonna cry.
Jeez. Well, I normally do write things down for a talk, but since I got here and realized that there was no desk or anything, I decided just to kind of wing it and talk since it's going to be a conversation.
Well, I wrote down some things for us.
Well, that's good, but that was extremely generous, and thanks for the introduction. And I remember those days really fondly too.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Yeah, I mean, just watching REM ascend the way they did was, I mean, there were a lot of bands that ascended, but there were very few bands, if any, that ascended the way REM did.
We were really,
values intact.
Well, we were really lucky, and you mentioned two labels, IRS and Warner's. We were really lucky to have this incubation period of really a couple of years of just playing around Athens and doing a little bit of travel.
Yeah.
A single, then an EP, then a record that sold modestly but got some critical acclaim. Yeah. And then we had this sort of stair step. It was a really slow ascent, and nowadays, in terms of numbers, that wouldn't be possible. You have to get a lot bigger, a lot quicker if you're going to be on a major label, which IRS was sort of a mini major.
Yeah, that's right. And that may be one of the things that we have lost that we need to reclaim, this idea of artist development. And that's precisely what artist development is all about. You you think there's any way to reclaim artist development as a practice these days?
Well, that may be the question that sets us off for a lot of the whole conversation, because so much of that is just the change. You know, back in those days, let's think about the things that were similar and the things that are now very different. If you're starting a band now, you're in a band, you're thinking about getting involved with a band, you're kind of thinking, how are you going to turn this from a hobby into a career? Certain of the fundamental things are still very much the same. You're trying to put together a career based on a lot of different sources of income, a little bit here, a little bit there, trying to somehow add that all into this portfolio that means you can quit your job and go out on the road and do what it takes to be a band. And most importantly, write great music and get people excited about you, know, and get people the word of mouth. That all so much the same, but so much has changed in this concept of artist development, where labels would make long-term investments in artists because of long-term upside prospects. That's just so much different now because of the economics and the amount of music that can be consumed cheaply or freely, which doesn't necessarily add up to a living wage.
Right. Well, let's back up a little bit. I want to go to your career path, your particular path, because it's not atypical. You were an attorney. You were in school to be, you were in law school.
I was in law school
when you were hooked up with REM. How did you first become involved with REM?
Well, I would say there's an old saying that everything you need to know, you learned in kindergarten. With me, everything I need to know, I learned the freshman year of college, because I had 2 jobs that summer, and they both ended up being pretty significant in my own personal development, and kind of set me on a path, I think, toward law school and ultimately toward meeting the band. One is that I worked at the Fulton County Jail, which was a very overcrowded Atlanta public. Well, most jails are public. It wasn't a private jail. And it was sort of a real eye-opening experience for us little, I guess I was barely 18, turned 19 that summer, had 1 year of college, and I learned more that summer about all kinds of things, but certainly about opportunity and decisions, and it was a great experience. But then as soon as the jail job was over at 3, we had a little time, and we weren't making very much money working at the jail. It was like a little stipend for essentially an internship program. So I went down to the Fairmont Hotel, where I got to be a bellhop at the brand new, just opened Fairmont Hotel, where the Rolling Stones were basing their southeast swing of their tour. It was called Tour of the Americas in 1975 with Billy Preston. And I remember just thinking how cool it was that these really old guys, they must have been like 30 or something. And I just thought, isn't that amazing? These old guys are still doing this rock and roll. I just was sort of blown away. I was so impressed. And it was also just kind of neat and sort of heady as this little guy in a bellhop suit. I just changed out of my gym stuff from the jail and put on a little bellhop suit. And we got to essentially take care of the Rolling Stones and get tipped and see them in the bar, and they all had assumed names. I just thought the whole thing was very kind of mysterious and cool and English and, like I say, old. And so I didn't, at that point, I didn't decide, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to become REM's manager. This was 1975, but I did sort of get interested in music, and I went back to my college, which was Davidson, a small liberal arts school that did not have a music business program. But I did the next best thing, which is I got involved in the college radio station, and I got involved in the concert committee. I bet most people in this room have either been involved with radio or concert committees at university unions. And so that kind of set me on a path to that. And once I got to Athens, I got on the concert committee again. And on that committee was a young guy, a pre-law student from Macon, Georgia, named Bill Berry. At the local record store, I got to know Peter, talking about different Neil Young records and which ones were worth buying and which bootlegs were worth buying. And I kind of got involved in that and started helping them out very informally. Pretty much right after I got out of law school, they needed somebody with a decent head on their shoulders and somebody to kind of advise them about some early things like that first single, eventually signing with IRS Records. So. The red thread that seems to run through your story and getting connected with REM, and that seems to be a part of so many managers' stories, is the desire to help the music or help the people they love, or the music those people make, reach the world, and the desire to share. It seems to me that's always. I was on a panel with Chris Blackwell a couple of years ago, and it's basically what he talked about, just working in a hotel.
and hearing this band perform, and his overriding urges were to share and to help.
To let other people know.
To let other people know.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. So there's been this huge change. Well, let me ask you what the I actually had a question about the way you evolved your attitudes about file sharing. You know, there's been this tremendous change in the music industry since 1981. First, if you care to talk a little bit about its impact on the band in a very real way, and I'd be curious to hear your attitudes and thinking about music sharing, file sharing, as it, you know, and if they evolved as it evolved.
Sure. I mean, I remember just even, I guess just in general, coming to realize the internet is permanent. Now, to y'all, the internet's been permanent pretty much since you were born. For me, I have this rear view mirror remembering, I have this disadvantage. It's a true disadvantage. And I'm really glad y'all are just starting your career without this rear view mirror. Because it's a real hindrance, because you know, we used to have this simple little business. There was kind of one way to do it. You were good. It started for writing good songs, but there are lots of bands with good songs. And then it started with expanding your influence, other people wanting to come see you and get excited about you and sharing with their own friends. No matter what I thought or what you thought of your favorite band, are other people interested in it? Are other people beating down the doors to get to their show? Right. Are they, you know, doing the circuit and every time they go back playing a bigger place, or being able to play 2 shows, or a weekend night? You know, those little kind of indicia. Yeah. But I remember, I think the very first time this is like a huge revelation to me. This would have been about 97 or 98. I was doing a talk down at Stetson in Florida, and I was given a riff about the fact that people could think about doing an internship. At this time, I was mentioning something like the Future Music Organization. I think I was talking about the RIAA, because they had a lot. It was a well-known path to getting a job at a label. If you're at a law school, you go to the RIAA, do an internship there. You then go into a label. You then go into management or being a lawyer at a private firm. It was a fairly well-known way to do it, if you could do it. And I was getting ready to tell them that, you know, you could give them a call and they'd send you something. And somebody said, "Don't they just have a website?" And that's the first time I kind of went, oh, website. People are actually, there's so much now that's getting put on the web just by nature of, I mean, the bottom line on file sharing for me is the internet is a file sharing medium. It's what it is. Yeah. It's just, it's the world's largest copying machine. And I realized that pretty early on, and I took kind of an agnostic view of it. You know, you have to look at the positive opportunity, being able to instantly transfer all this around, which can be a positive thing for marketing and promotion. Yeah. But has it had an effect on sales? Absolutely. Oh, yeah. To me, the bigger issue now, we may get into it later, is just all these services that are legal, the Spotifys and the RDOs and the YouTubes and a lot of the streaming services that are essentially substitutional for what people used to do, which was buy music or buy downloads, and whether that's going to ever add up to something that can sustain careers.
Yeah, well, why don't we get into that a little bit? I mean, number one, you know, how do you make money when copies are free is the big deal. You know, where do you see opportunities for generative value, and number two, can it even add up? You know, can these streaming services add up? I don't know. How big do they have to scale before they can possibly add up? And there's noise, and there's noise in there as well. There's so much noise. Yeah.
I think it's early, so nobody really knows. Yeah. I think to me, there's a fundamental problem. It's a problem. It's an opportunity. It's just a fact. It's just a reality. I kind of consider myself a copy realist as opposed to a copy leftist. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's the way people live. But I think there's this fundamental fact that there was this time when the golden era of the music business, like what Billy and I grew up in, CDs were selling like hotcakes. Yeah. Pretty much a pretty successful band could put a record out, sell 10 million copies with any luck at all. It was a fairly, it didn't happen to everybody, but it happened to enough people that it was a fairly common thing. Yeah. And that was at a time when there was really not much competition. There weren't that many records being released, relatively speaking. Even if you add all the major labels up, there aren't that many records being released. It was a fairly finite pool because it took a certain amount of money to make the record. You had only a certain number of bands that got signed in a given year, only a certain number of bands in a given genre would even put it out. And then radio station playlists were so tight that if you were lucky enough to get on one, Yours was the song everybody was hearing, and they went out and bought the record. It was a beautiful world. It was a beautiful, simple little world.
Yeah, for those that had it.
For those who had it, for those who won the lottery. The people who put themselves in that position, and then there were tours and festivals and all the other ancillary ways of making money from it too.
Right.
All right, now contrast that with what we got now, which is instead of these gatekeepers artificially keeping scarcity, thanks to technology, costs going down, entry barriers being lowered. A friend of mine named Matt Druin, who's a real good manager of he should come here sometime. He's one of the smartest managers I know, and he's more your demographic, young guy, no rear view mirror for him. He manages a band called Metric out of Canada. Yeah. He says, there's still gatekeepers, but now all the fences are down. So you still got these gatekeepers trying to have their influence, and they still have some, but everybody's coming over the gates. It's much, much easier for everybody to do it. So now with the streaming services, with their 14 million songs, their 20 million songs, or whatever it is, available on mobile or wherever, you've got way more music being released, streamable, at these little tiny fractions. So even if you're very, very popular, your song gets streamed a lot, it's having to be divided against so many others as part of that same pool. So I don't think the math's ever going to work out. It's never going to work out the same. Right. I don't think they're ever, if you compare a successful band and what they made in real dollars by having tours and merch sales and sales of a certain superstar level, compare that now to a successful band and what they're ever going to make out of a YouTube or a Spotify royalty, I think it's unlikely to ever reach an equivalency. The optimistic scenario, we did a panel last year at South by Southwest on what do the pennies actually work out? What are these little micro payments on places like Spotify? And that's the one we focused on because it's certainly the trendy one, the one that a lot of people are using right now. What does it actually net out to artists? What does it actually do in terms of the bottom line? And it's at this point pretty discouraging. There's a lot of artists holding out. There are a lot of artists windowing and saying, I'm not going to give it to Spotify until the first 3 months have gone so I can sell some records and then we'll worry about getting it on the streaming services. They're giving up the promotional advantage there. But the optimistic scenario is that in the countries where it got started a few years ago, where it's got a really good market absorption, and where it's not just people that are on Spotify, but it's people paying to be on Spotify. So there's the ad-supported free stuff that most people are on. Certainly in America, most people that are on Spotify are on that. But if you can upsell people to that premium service so that I think there's a few bells and whistles. The main one I know of is that you can hear it on your mobile device.
Yeah, you carry it around.
You can carry it around with you. Yeah, you can I think cache it so you can listen to it as you go for a jog or something. You don't necessarily need internet. So they say that in those countries, particularly they happen to be in Scandinavia, they're very hard to compare those countries to America. But if you ever get to the point where half your subscribers are actually paying the $9.95 a month, the math gets better. Right. The math gets better for everybody. So that's the sort of optimistic scenario. And the other part of that if you buy a record back in the days, you sell a record 20 years ago, it sells one time. Right. An artist theoretically makes a little money off that one sale. On Spotify, if that record continues to be played and shared and playlisted and zapped around the world to all your friends, it continues to have some popularity and some ears actually tuning in. It's getting, a little tiny fraction of a penny, but it's getting, there's a payment scheme all the way through.
Yeah, it's a cumulative effect.
So it's early. I mean, the answer to that one is I'm afraid it's hard to know. But given how much more music is now available and how much more what people are paying for is less a given piece of music and more everything. Yes. Everybody's paying for everything all the time. Yeah. And so it's just hard to see how the math's going to work out the same.
So having said all that, I have to ask, given everything we have in front of us today, would REM be on a label today? Would they ever sign?
Don't know. Really good question. There's less reason to.
Yeah.
There's less. You used to be able to sign to a label and get thousands of, at least hundreds. It may be a slight, typical music business. You exaggerate a lot. You at least would have hundreds of people around the world all doing one thing: getting your band on the radio. Yep. It was essentially what labels did, and they were really good at it. And it was the only way you'd get on the radio, other than college radio, other than kind of non-commercial radio, public radio, and that was a really important coordinative. That was like armies of people. Making your record a priority, and it becomes the single, and it drives sales. Yeah. And now labels they're still around, and they're still reinventing themselves, and they still do a lot of good, but it's a lot less people. Yeah. And they're a lot more busy doing a lot more things, and nobody really knows which part of it works. But labels now are so they're kind of becoming more like management companies, and management companies are becoming more like labels.
A little bit more like labels, yeah.
Management companies now are kind of full service, can do all the same things, starting I guess with network and red light. Some of those have kind of they've beefed up to the point where they may as well be labels themselves, and labels are trying to get down to kind of the size and flexibility that the management companies have.
Right. Well, we teach management, artist management, and building artist enterprises here. Artist management is biz dev. It's business development, right? And so I would imagine that starting today, you'd be in the same position those red lights are in. You need to start something that can be more rewarding financially to your artist, assuming that that's what you want to do is maximize revenue.
Well, it seems that your question about would an REM of today be on a label, it kind of depends on what the artist wants, and I think a lot of it's still very genre driven. If you're a pop artist, certainly if you're a teenage artist, that's going to appeal and be sort of not necessarily built for the long term,
of the moment,
it's going to be most likely going to have sort of an expiration date fairly soon. I think labels are certainly the place to be, and certainly there are people still signing to labels, but I know there are bands right now that are really considering signing to a label and deciding to do it themselves or do something through one of the services that get you on iTunes themselves.
Yeah, there's many.
Or there seems to be a thriving that middle sector. Arcade Fire's on Merge. Head and the Heart's on Sub Pop. I mean, you have bands that are certainly major label worthy that are choosing. There's a better way for us. We can keep more control. We're going to have a lot of our own management people, our own office people doing a lot of those kinds of jobs, putting a team together. So
keep more of the money.
So many more ways of doing it now.
Right. It's funny, I don't know how many people know that you refer to yourself not as an artist manager, but as an advisor generally.
Yeah, that's always been kind of a credit on the... I mean, one time they put me on as Minister of Defense or something like that. They always came up with funny ways to credit me, sort of this, whatever I am. I mean, basically the band manages themselves.
I was going to say, was it a conscious decision to be a one-band management company, number one? And number two, how much of what you guys built as an organization had to do with the personality of the band members?
All of that. It was definitely, from the very beginning, REM, they started slow, they had low expectations, they didn't have a lot of an overhead. They were just doing it as a hobby while they were still in school. It became a kind of a little more serious than a hobby, and they were not in school. And then it was with the label signing and increasing record sales, was like, this is sort of a career, for at least for a while. And then we just kind of built it as just all around them. It was essentially a cottage industry. And we started the fan club and some of the mailers. It was probably a big mistake, but we never raised the price of the fan club from $10. And that was in 1980s dollars. And when they broke up a year ago, it was still $10 to be in the fan club. It was not exactly a real big profit center for us, but it was a goodwill thing. And
seemed to be in line with your ethos, though.
Yeah, and people were proud of the association. They were our best missionaries and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
But it was very much personality driven. And my relationship with the band to this day, now that they're not an ongoing, they're now a business, and there's catalog, and there's considerations about reissues and licensing, use in movies, TV shows, those kinds of things. It's very driven by what their values are and how they want to present themselves, and they very much own their own decisions. And I'm involved with, just helping decide, and if we need to have a meeting or it needs to be an email exchange, kind of marshaling consensus. They've never voted in their entire career. They never took a vote on anything. They always had to all agree on something. Which is the reason they didn't do a lot of things, because they didn't all agree to do it.
Right.
It was never like a voting situation.
Well, that was one of the values I thought that was always so attractive, was that the band was a democracy, even though bands aren't democracies really, or have a hard time being democracies. Every songwriting credit was Barry Buckmill Stipe. And everything was REM Athens Limited, and it was all the organization was the organization. I think that I'm curious as to whether or not you found that as an attorney you brought certain efficiencies to that operation.
Probably. I guess the main we had law firms, one in Atlanta for some corporate and those kind of issues, and a little bit of IP, and then a California law firm called Gang Tire that we worked with all through the Warner Brothers days and deals and all that stuff that we always used. But I think my legal training probably helped in terms of some communication skills and just whatever the critical thinking and just being able to identify issues. And I don't think it hurts to have a law degree. When I went to law school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to do anything with a history major out of Davidson. So I figured I'd go to law school and figure out. And I was very interested in music. I had always kind of wondered what would it be like to be an entertainment lawyer, but I didn't really even know what one was till I sort of started doing it with those guys.
Well, we have a lot of students who end up going to law school. Yeah. This program seems to spit out lawyers very efficiently. You mentioned the kinds of things you had law firms associated with law firms for IP. And could you speak a little bit about use cases, like instances where you'd need a lawyer from an IP standpoint or from a corporate standpoint?
Sure, because they do a lot of those kinds of heavy lifting on drafting and documents and corporate minutes, all pension plans, the employee benefits issues, sometimes insurance issues, those kind of things. You need a law firm.
And now, as a company, how big did you guys get? How unwieldy did it become? You talk about pensions and employee benefits and things like that.
Our structure was we had a fairly small group of people that worked in an office.
Yeah.
Various people who did essentially assisting and making arrangements and helping facilitate things. There was a time when it was like literally typing and stuff until everybody started doing their own typing because everything went to email. But there was a whole part of our career where that was, we had essentially clerical people and assistants, and then it all kind of evolved, and we had a fan club person. We had a guy who did our art stuff. We had a person who did just our fan club stuff. Right. But then we had a CPA office did a lot of that stuff too, an accounting firm.
Right.
Actually functioned as a business manager and did a lot of that.
Right. You learned management on the job, as I would imagine most managers do. Most managers that start out with a band or work for a band. Can you describe your learning process down, through those early stages?
I went to a lot of things like this.
Yeah.
We didn't have a formal music business program at my college or at my law school, but I would soak up whenever possible a chance to go to an afternoon seminar on current legal issues in the music business, learning record deals, learning publishing deals. And I would go to stuff like that, whether it was in Atlanta or in New York or Nashville, just to learn. Once you're a lawyer, you have to do this thing called continuing legal education. Before you're a lawyer, as a law student, they generally let you come for free or for $10 or something. Right. And so I would essentially, South by Southwest did not exist yet, but I would have been there.
Yeah.
You did those kind of things. And the thing I do to this day is that, because I have that rear view mirror, because I have that orientation from having grown up in a completely different world before the internet existed, or certainly before it had disrupted the business we're in, I really make a point of keeping up with a lot of the same kind of stuff you get. Some of these push emails from Digital Music News and some of these basically media surveys that come on a daily basis, and you can just click on and get pretty much the most recent news on rate negotiations or the various things about webcasting or Spotify or the effect on sales, and that's just a good way to keep in touch with us. You have to be a student of this stuff, no matter how old you get.
Yeah, you never stop, right?
The technology doesn't.
Right. Because our world is changing. You can't cease to change.
Yeah.
So, how did you handle, as an organization, planning, goal setting? Did you ever, or was it always just fielding success for REM?
That's a question I've never thought about. Let me think how I want to answer that. We weren't necessarily all that great on the planning. I guess in a way, like as we were in their time, they were really busy.
Yeah.
Doing lots of tours and making lots of records, and then being on a label and doing all the promotional stuff and going on TV shows and overseas to do stuff. There was a
cycle. There's a cycle. And you're in that cycle, and
The most important thing to know about the cycle at the beginning is when, and then how long, and then what's the nature of it going to be, and then who are the opening acts going to be. That was always an easy decision for us because I thought of this when you were talking about being with the musicians, they only picked bands they liked, which is why they always gave them full sound checks and full production.
Yeah, and money.
And their trucks carried the merch and all that kind of stuff, which was great because they liked the bands, and our guys made a point of being there on the side of the stage, watching the bands, and kind of vice versa. It also was really easy because it kept me out of a lot of really yucky conversations about like getting somebody's band on as a favor, because that was just never the way they operated. It was very artist driven, and they picked way in advance all the way through the end of their career. They did that. So there was a certain amount of planning and cycling like that, but in terms of like mission statements and vision statements and goal setting like that, they never really did have all that stuff.
Right.
They were really much more just, they liked writing songs, they liked going on tour, and they liked having that make some kind of business economic sense, and they liked taking time off. And then later in their career, they take, this is a year off. This is Widespread Panic does it now. A lot of bands, they just need to kind of restore their creative juices. They also now have families. They also have other interests, want to make films, want to do some side projects and stuff. So that became an important part of the cycle, is time away from this stuff. Because the first 10 years, they didn't take any time away from it. And, that just about breaks a band up. So you got to start having some of this breathing room to be able to come back and make great records.
Can I ask you to recall a setback and how you dealt with it?
The entire 1995 tour. It was definitely the 1995 tour. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Other than Terry. That's Terry Carlson. He was the only merchandising representative REM ever had in their whole career. He sold every T-shirt, not literally physically, but he was counting them. He was there. He's working for a local institution called the New Orleans Saints now, I think. Is that right?
It's a long career.
Are they in the Super Bowl? Not this year. Not this year.
All right.
What the Super Bowl's
you don't want to open a wound. The Super Bowl's here.
It's not a home game.
Yeah, it's not a home game.
But the 1995 tour was an interesting setback. There may be a better answer than this, but I'll go with this one for now, which was that 3 different band members in about a 5-month period have had pretty serious operations, as in surgical operations, which caused us to lose large chunks of our tour. First of all, they were the first one, especially since it was brain surgery and really life or death. The second one was pretty serious too. The third one, they were all serious enough. They were all under general anesthesia, having to have surgery. But they caused us to lose these chunks of tours that were, in these cases back in 95 all through Europe. These were sold out shows. It has quite a bit of an economic ramification. And it made us very glad and validated feeling that we had purchased large amounts of insurance. You buy this stuff called non-appearance insurance when you tour. Sometimes you do, some bands don't. And if you don't have it, you pretty much have all these obligations and all these projections, and you can't do the shows, you don't get paid. So we had this real interesting year. It was extremely stressful, and I was just saying today at the earlier session over at the law school, it's kind of amazing, but pieces of paper with little handwriting and this thing called fax, this old, really cool whiz-bang technology called faxes.
Which in my opinion is the most miraculous piece of technology there is. Think about that.
I remember when we got a fax. Well, I guess we should get one. Everybody else seems to have one now. Soon we were kind of living on these faxes. We got through the 95 tour and did not know what an email was. I mean, email did not exist. This was, it had trucks, it had lights, it was modern times. The 95 tour, it was filmed. There's a film out of it. It looks like the kind of show that would happen now. And I don't know how we did it, but we did it without computers. We did it. I mean, there were some mainframe computers somewhere keeping up with numbers and all. But every bit of the information transfer on that tour, not to mention things like artwork, and the fact that you could get something there in a couple days was amazing to us. Now, if it's not there in about 5 seconds, somebody's wondering where it is. But the 95 tour, that was a lot of setbacks because of the 3 different the brain surgery, the other 2 surgeries that Mike and Michael went through. And we dealt with them. Just you kind of play the cards you're dealt. You get by on very little sleep. You hope that you're the responsible adult that can help, get good decisions made. One of my jobs was always knowing what I have to check with the band with and what I don't. You better get it right. You better not bug them with every little thing, but you also better not skip something that they really needed to know about. So there's sort of an art to knowing when to call a meeting. I called a meeting once before a show in Chicago, and it was not a good idea because it went on too long, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically was kind of a boneheaded time to try to get the guys to focus on something. It was
Right.
really important. They needed to focus on it.
Yeah.
They had a show to do in a half an hour.
Yeah.
So you kind of got to pick your spots. So.
Yeah, thinking like an artist is a huge part of being a manager, I suppose, and making sure that you never think like an artist is a big part of being.
Well, yeah, both. Yeah.
I would imagine that they were happy they had you when it came to the non-appearance insurance.
Yeah, that happened a few times over
I'm
the
not
years.
sure that would have occurred to them on their own, had they never had a manager.
Oh, that was early days. We always believed in buying insurance. That was partly a professor of mine at University of Georgia Law School, civil procedure professor, who said always buy as much insurance as you can afford, and they will sell you.
Yeah.
And we kind of made a point of always getting that non-appearance. It was a hefty premium. It ranged. It was sort of 3-4% of your projected gross. So it was a large check, beginning of a tour, that you had to pay as essentially a bet that you're going to not finish your tour.
Yeah.
And you normally finished your tour,
Yeah.
which is why insurance companies make a lot of money,
Yeah.
because they normally are hanging on to all that money
Yeah.
from all those bands, all of whom may lose a show or two. But to have 30 and 40 shows, sold out shows, canceled, was a real setback.
Yeah, that's huge, and that's a. Can I? We mentioned the word values a couple of times. How big a role do you feel that values played in your conscious conduct of the business? I mean, you guys, how much reflection on values?
They just want to.
Is there?
It's funny. We're using that word here because it's a good shorthand for
Yeah.
a set of principles or standards. But you mentioned earlier about the fact that they always wrote the songs democratically. It was always Barry Buck Mills type, and then Buck Mills type after Bill left the band. And it was just more of it wasn't necessarily a conscious thing, but in a way it was. I mean, it was something that they definitely, they had ways they wanted to do things.
Yeah.
And there were some kind of critical times that it was like, time to decide, are we going to, they definitely were offered money for songs and commercials and all. Nowadays, every band does it. Every band's happy for the exposure. It's like another way to expose your music. And we're still from that, we're kind of not, there's still a few artists, they tend to be older artists like ourselves, who don't want to have the association. Neil Young said, I don't want people to, when they hear that song, be thinking of a product.
Yeah.
It's just not what he wrote. So that was those kinds of decisions were just early on in their career, and then they sort of stuck to them and thought, well, it's gotten us this far. And the label would, so depending on what the situation was, in terms of some of their artistic presentation, Miles used to get on us about the dark show.
Yeah.
Why aren't there any lights in your light show?
Yeah.
Why is it so dark? But they just had, and Michael would stand with his back to the audience
Yeah, it was
for
hair
a
in
year
his
or
face,
so. And it's just, they were artists. They were artists doing, he was sort of growing up as an artist.
Yeah.
That's the way he felt like performing, and he wasn't going to really be talked out of it, and it was.
Nor were you inclined to talk about it.
No, I wasn't, but.
Right. Yeah. Because to a certain extent, we have to, you defer to the artist's vision. And I really think that a lot of what I took from watching REM, I mean, I didn't, REM had been around for 10 or 11 years before I ever got into management, but I knew that that's how I would do things if I had the chance to do things.
If you were lucky enough to work with an artist who had, I guarantee you there are some artists that are 15 or 16 years old, or who are looking for somebody to have a heavy hand in how should they look, where should they move, who should they hire as a producer. And I did get involved in some things like never how should they look or how should they move, but who to hire as a producer, where to think about recording, some things like that. It could be kind of a committee decision, a discussion. But there are artists that really don't have a clue.
Right.
And especially if they're kids or something, they are looking for somebody, with some experience who has some connections that might be able to give them a better direction. And I just think it's such an individual thing. And in the case of the REM guys from very, very early days, whatever they wanted to do was working, and they felt, whether it was working or not, they wanted to do it that way. So it was important to kind of get out of the way and let it be their band. It was always my guiding principle.
It's how people determined whether REM was their band or not. Was by letting REM be REM.
Yeah.
And enough people made them their band that I think it's safe to say that worked.
Yeah.
I have two last items, and then I'd like to open this up for questions, because Bertis is more than willing to answer questions, and I'm sure you guys have some. So, last thing second to last thing I'd like to ask you is if you have any kind of thoughts on today's best practices when it comes to legal and business affairs issues in running an artist enterprise. When an artist is a new artist, at what point do contracts start to matter? and agreements between band members, agreements with producers, those kinds of things. Do you have strong feelings about that?
Well, I think people probably do them later than they should.
Yeah.
They should probably get on it sooner, and I think people should avail themselves of resources in their local community they might not even know about, like Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts.
Right.
I'm sure there's a vibrant organization that's got a name about like that in New Orleans. There's certainly one in Atlanta. Because there are definitely lawyers that are happy to help young, aspiring, up-and-coming artists.
Right.
And on a fee-reduced or a fee-friendly basis.
Right.
And it's probably better to do that sooner than later.
Yeah.
Because once certain assumptions get made, handshakes, it's harder later to reverse that,
Yeah.
and you end up with some pretty sticky situations.
Right.
And then in terms of bands and those kinds of things, they're all kind of their own organism. And I think the most important thing, I guess we were good enough to do it for a long time, but it's just important to have clear, direct communication.
Yeah.
And every organism is different, and every personality is different, and some people hold more things in, and some people are more extroverted. And one thing a manager can do is definitely facilitate that kind of communication and honesty and directness and clarity of those kind of communications. That to me is a really important business practice or interpersonal practice, because bands are tricky things. I mean, there's that great Mercury Rev song that quotes about what happens to bands, and there's bands, those funny little plans that never work out right.
Yes.
And this is a band that made 20 years worth of records.
That's right.
Obviously, they were doing something that worked out right, but there's a lot of truth to that too.
Yeah. And then bringing it back to the people in this room, I think the last thing I'd like to ask you is, you get a little traction today, and you're setting up an artist business, trying to make enough to quit the day job to stay in it. Where do you start? What do you think? What do you think it takes to create that well-rounded, ecosystem around a band these days?
You're talking about for a band?
For an artist.
For an artist.
Yeah, for an artist.
Well, you certainly want somebody who can handle the books and taxes, and that's one of the early things we did is we got connected with a accounting firm that could, when there's money being generated and tax liabilities and withholding obligations and employees and there's that kind of stuff. You got to take care of those kind of bases once it gets to much of a level at all. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of it is, so much of it depends on what the artist's needs are.
Right.
Are they willing to do another year or two, kind of blood brothers or sisters out there doing this and sort of see how it goes, and they just crash in friends' houses and not have a huge income, or keep another job, which limits how much you can tour and how much flexibility there is. So much of it depends on that. Yeah.
But how would you start to put together the enterprise, the artist enterprise, in terms of beginning the development process toward, when a band begins to, or an artist begins to create that sort of traction, but needs to grow, needs to begin that process of artist development. Do you have any thoughts on what it would take these days, today, to sort of create the critical mass that allows sustainability?
I guess with the quizzical expression on my face, I'm not sure I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there's a good answer to that.
Yeah.
I guess the classic is that somebody who's got a track record, who knows what they're doing, hears about it, comes and sees it, gets excited, wants to put together a proposal and put together a team, and help get some demos made and all that. I don't know how realistic that still happens, or that's the desired scenario. Right. That's certainly a way it happens, and it certainly is the way it used to happen.
Well, I think you're right. I think that is what happens probably in most cases. But who's doing it? Which actor is the one precipitating that that activity is the trick.
It's a variable,
Yeah. How about questions? Anybody? We can bring you microphones. Questions for Bertis? Hands. Just put your hands up. Oh, come on. There you go.
We've been
Get us started.
Been so clear. Nobody has any questions.
Yeah.
Are y'all required to be here? Is that why you're still here? Obviously.
Check. Hello, guys. I'm Evan Thibodeau. My question to you is, what was your relationship with REM, like personally, and how do you think that affected your success?
Well, my relationship with them was that I knew two of the guys before the band started, one from the concert committee and one from the record store. And I was friendly with them. I was, buddies with them. And the other two I didn't know till after the band had started. And it was just kind of a part of our relationship all along. I knew him. We were social friends to a certain extent, but we were not like best friends. But you spend enough time with people, especially in years like the '95 tour, and the lack of sleep and the amount of common, both great and drudgerous experiences, you get to be pretty tight. You get to be pretty good friends with them. Either that or you don't last a long time. So we're all pretty good friends. And I think one of the things that when they decided to disband a little over a year ago, it's interesting to be back in New Orleans talking about all this stuff, because we made two early records.
Kingsway. Right?
Yeah, Kingsway with Daniel Lanois. We made Automatic for the People, and then
Music Shed.
We also made Monster.
Oh, you made Monster
part of Monster
Kingsway,
at Kingsway, and then we made a record at this place called the Music Shed on Terpsichore Street about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Pardon me? UTERP, maybe it's between UTERP and Terpsichore.
All right, let's not.
It's around the corner from a cool little cafe that serves like Jamaican food and stuff. We got to know New Orleans fairly well over many, many years. So yeah, it was definitely kind of part of the plan was they've been doing it a long time. They made 15 records. They had a really nice run, ebbed and flowed in popularity, and being really huge and having records not do as well, and yet people were interested in them all the way, but they wanted to still be friends. And they kind of had this commitment to each other. They were only going to do it as long as it was really fun. And it was really fun for a long time. And then you know what? They're still friends, and even after they disbanded, they're still friends. So that was better than often the scenario works out.
Yeah. Anybody else? Well, I have a question. Rosabelle has a question. It's more important that you ask.
I feel like nowadays with things like the internet and different means of communication, it's really important for a band to have a brand for marketing, or what their listeners or viewers perceive to be their brand. Was that something that REM had? Did you have something that you specifically connotated with your brand, or was it all just kind of natural?
I would say it was closer to an organic, natural process. In fact, one of the band members in particular cannot stand hearing the word brand associated with anything involving a band. It's so wrong to him. It's the way we talk now. It's the way the world has gone, but it doesn't mean he has to like it. That's just the. But I think that certainly their name, they considered other names before they picked REM, but they wanted a name that would be kind of like elastic, that would sort of like, it didn't really mean any particular thing. It didn't pigeonhole them as a certain kind of band when they got started. They got started right at the time with the Clash and the Sex Pistols and Talking Heads and all these sort of what were then became pretty quickly known as new wave bands. They didn't want a name that sounded like that kind of band. They just wanted a name that would be a little more vague sounding. So I think right now, to me, brand is something, I understand what you mean by that, and it's good. It's a good catchphrase for signifying other things. I think the real key now is even in the days of labels, there was always a lot of a relationship between bands and fans. Just an identity. Back in our days, I don't know if people still do it, but put posters up in your room. It was something you were proud of because you put the windows down and other people comment on what you were listening to in your car. It was sort of an identity sort of a cultural identity, no different than with other brands nowadays too. But that relationship is easier than ever with the internet. That's the good news. The bad news is it's harder to make any money. You can have a lot of fans who love you that don't really spend any money on you, and you don't really have a career, unless you figure out a way to use another buzzword, monetize that relationship. But that's more and more the whole email lists and ways of reaching people, and bands that I still constantly amazed, bands you've never heard of, bands that have never penetrated the mass market. They somehow have a niche, but they're doing incredibly well just because their base knows about what they're doing. And there are so many ways to tend that base and feed that base and reach them and expand it.
Yeah, I think there may be so many ways to create sustainability for a band where a band can earn a handsome living without being a band that anyone's heard of.
We maybe head more in that direction.
Or where an artist is. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you can earn a handsome living wage, let's say. You know, I know a lot of people who earn about as much as a busy plumber
Right.
or electrician by being in a
But they're
band.
have the life they want to have.
Yeah, exactly.
There's an organization, I bet you've all heard of it, called the Future of Music Coalition in D.C.
Yeah.
They have a conference every fall, usually in October.
Yep.
Highly worthwhile. I don't know if any of you are DC oriented, or because it's kind of policy and digital and tech, or tech industry and music.
Right.
And their whole stated purpose, one of their missions is figuring out what's the future of music that sustains a musical middle class.
That's
a
right.
middle class of musicians.
Yeah.
Not as many people are going to win the lottery. There's not as much of a lottery to win.
Yeah, right.
But there is a living to be made. Surely there's a way that if people are good and high quality and put out stuff people like,
Yeah.
they ought to be able to at least be able to afford some insurance,
Right.
have
Well,
reasonable
just
standard of living,
Yeah.
and not have to keep working that day job.
and just as in the real economy, the macro economy, the middle class is the first to be hurt by these things. It's carved out, right? That's the first soldiers to go down in the music revolution too, this internet revolution. The first ones to be really hurt, the canaries in the coal mine, were the middle class artists.
Yeah.
And I think that we're in a position where middle class artists can maybe be at an advantage now to build a business, to build an artist business that can create sustainability. You may not be heard of by many people in the country or in the world, but you make a damn good living making the music that you want to make. I think that's really
I
important.
think that's the hope, yeah.
Is there another question? TC.
Bertis, my question to you is, knowing that REM, the band members picked opening acts to take on the road with them, during your career as an advisor with REM, what is and currently is your policy when it comes to a singer-songwriter or band soliciting their CDs, materials to you with hopes of honestly you listening to the materials? Do they need to be referred by someone you know?
No, I mean, I open my mail. People thank me for returning their phone calls sometime, and I say, don't worry, I return everybody's phone call eventually. Nowadays, there's hardly any phone calls because it's all email. I actually forget to return phone calls because I get so few compared to, used to get a lot of phone calls, and then email just kind of took over. So no, I generally, I open mail, but I also, I'm not looking to find the next REM either. I'm not sure the next REM could be REM. It's such a different world, and I still have that rear view mirror that's probably a real disadvantage.
It's a handicap.
Yeah.
Yes, brother. We'll follow up.
The reason I ask is 11 years previous to meeting you and working with you for that 25-year period, I managed a band from Minnesota. And I found probably 8 out of 10 contacts that I made, there was no return. It was a form letter, went straight to the garbage.
Yeah, I think we're talking about REM's values here.
And I think it's probably also, that statistic has probably gotten worse because the world is a busy, darn place. It's so, everybody, I don't care where you're sitting or what, everybody's got so much stuff coming at them compared to 11 years before. Yeah. I mean, that was like primitive, right? I mean, when we got started, it was nowhere near the ways of communicating, and now everybody does communicate, and it's harder and harder to respond. So I think that number's probably gone down.
Well, less than a year before I met you, I attended a thing called the New Music Seminar in New York City.
Yep.
All the talk was about REM. All the talk was about Prince.
Right.
And Lenny Warnaker was on the panel that I listened to.
Yep.
Lenny turned to the audience, me being one of the 1,500 in the audience, and said, everyone up here has to realize nobody knows nothing.
Yeah.
You people up there could have our job at any time. And always remember that. And he says, the example is, how come we all up here passed on Prince?
Yeah.
And how come the guy that had that cassette tape is now out on the street without a gig?
Yeah.
And we signed him the second time around.
Yeah.
And he said, nobody knows nothing.
When I was at Davidson, the concert committee I was on had the ignominious distinction of the year before having passed on Bruce Springsteen. Because he wanted to come play our little college and play a coffee house, but it was like $1,000, and they were like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I would have not made that decision, but you're definitely right. I never knew Lenny was the, I think other people might have said nobody knows nothing, but it's a great quote. I've used it before. I never knew it was Lenny that said that. He signed REM 6 years later to Warner Brothers.
Yeah, and his son had something to do with REM as well.
He was the reason he signed Warner's, and then his son ended up playing drums with us right after Bill left the band for a couple of tours.
That's right. I think it has a lot to do with REM being who REM is. I know that Throwing Muses, when they were 14 years old, they gave Peter Buck a tape, and he listened to it and responded, talked to them the year later. That's the kind of band they were. Anybody else have a question while we're here? Yes. Just, can we shout it out or no? No. Gotta get the mic for the video.
Hi. I was just wondering that after coming from an educational background that wasn't quite as music business oriented, whether you found that having that experience under your belt or actually being on the road touring with REM developed your management style in a more productive way?
Well, I never had really studied music business the way y'all are getting to do it now with a curriculum. But I'd been a student of the music business, just reading books and like I said, in college and certainly in law school, going to some seminars and some continuing education kind of things. And just being a fan. I mean, you can learn a lot by reading. Do y'all know what a thing called liner notes is? I mean, I know that doesn't really exist anymore, but you can read liner notes. You can pick up stuff like, who owns the copyright on this?
Yeah.
How do they do the publishing? What's this weird BMI ASCAP thing? What's all? So you can kind of learn from that just by being curious about it, even as a kid without any formal instruction in it. But then certainly starting to do it helps you sort of. We're putting out a single. We're putting out an EP. We're thinking about signing with Warner, but with IRS. But early on too, I realized the limitations of my own experience, which was not much, and my own knowledge, which needed to grow. And so I was lucky to have some mentors that were much more senior to me at law firms that I could I was the advisor to the band, but a lawyer could handle the nitty-gritty of the negotiation, and I can learn from them by being at their side and be sort of co-counsel. So I did that pretty early on, really as early as '82 when we signed to IRS. I wasn't going to try to do that by myself, completely by the seat of my pants. So I was willing to do some things by the seat of my pants, but other things I needed some expert help on, and I enlisted that when that was the case.
Right.
And to this day, I wouldn't try to do a corporate reorganization. I'm really happy there are corporate lawyers that do that stuff because it's not what I do bread and butter.
Right. Well, I think you all can learn an awful lot from being the kind of music business people that this organization was. REM Athens was an amazing organization and very values driven, very centered on doing the right thing every time. And I want you to join me in thanking Bertis for being here. Thank you so much.